their office expense. It took about 24 hours before every caucus in Washington was upset. But what you have to understand is there is still the ability for these organizations to meet. There will still be supplied the rooms. They can use their own staff people to serve in whatever function that the caucus needs. The only difference is they can't take allocated office expense money, your money, and put it over to where they're hiring people who are not under the same guidelines as federal employees. So in fact, what we tried to do was eliminate any question of impropriety by caucuses and to become better stewards of in fact, your money. Quickly we learned, though, if you don't upset people in Washington, you haven't really accomplished any change. We came out on about the third day that we were in Washington and said, based upon what we'd like to cut, based upon the contract's commitment to cut a third of the committee staff, we think we're going to be able to sell an office building. What a great Christmas present for the American people to walk out on one of those office buildings with a red bow around it and put up a for sale sign. Well, you know, it was a great idea until we got to looking into some of the laws, and we found the McKinney Act. The McKinney Act that Congress passed several years ago that said when a federal agency sells a building, that other federal agencies have first right of refusal on that building. If for any reason another federal agency does not purchase that building, it becomes a homeless shelter. So, you know, to share with you some of the frustration now to go through that process, one, we're doing a cost analysis to make sure that we don't have leased space in Washington that can be absorbed by that building. But to actually go through with the process, we'll have to change the McKinney Act to actually sell an office building so that we ensure ourselves of not having a homeless shelter right next to your nation's capital. These are some of the things that have happened over the years. Just this week, last week, excuse me, we found 3 offices in the Capitol we didn't even know existed. I was with a senior member who'd been there for 18 years who had never seen the inside the Ways and Means room. This is the type of Washington that we've had for the last several years. And one of the things that you will see on January the 4th is a very historic day. The day that each member of Congress is sworn in will actually be the day that we go in session. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon of January the 4th, the 104th Congress will go in session and will pass 9 different congressional reforms that day. The first one will be the Shays Amendment, which applies all laws to Congress that apply to the rest of us. Nobody ever stopped to think about the fact that when we apply all laws to Congress, that Congress has to change their habits or they're in big trouble. Let me give you, for instance, if you're like I am, occasionally late at night you flip by C-SPAN and you say, how could the House be in session at 11 or 12 o'clock at night? Well, when we apply all laws to Congress, all of a sudden we're under the same overtime rules that each one of you as independent businessmen are. And all of a sudden we have a staff who we're responsible to make sure that their hours are in sync with what federal law says. It's impossible to keep a schedule where you're voting on bills at 12 o'clock every night because we'll never have the funds in the budget to pay for the staff overtime. So, in fact, even though it's somewhat of a hurdle for us to overcome that we didn't anticipate, understand that it's applying those rules to Congress that's going to make Congress change. It's going to make Congress go in and actually look at a legislative agenda in a way that you can confidently look at it and say they must be doing things right. They're not voting on bills at midnight. They're voting on them during the day. They're actually trying to close up for staff business at 7 or 7:30 at night. I think that it's in fact these reforms that will bring Congress more in sync with what we go through in the business world every day. I was tickled to death to know that Cass Ballinger will head the subcommittee on OSHA. Stop and think about that one if you know Cass Ballinger. For those of us in business, there's a serious change fixing to happen with Cass Ballinger in charge. But I think that probably the biggest indication of what we're trying to do right now really has been seen in the short period of time that we've been in Washington. It's probably best displayed in the way that the leadership of each party have lined up. I think that we see the most distance between Republicans and Democrats. And when I say that, we've got Republicans and Democrats in this room. I'm not talking about us, but I'm talking about the leadership in Congress. That it is so far apart ideologically in their beliefs right now that when you see Dick Gephardt and David Bonnier on one side, who are probably as close to the left as you can get, and you see the Republican Party go slightly right of center for their leadership, this is the biggest gap that we've had in Congress in my lifetime between the two parties. So I think it also gives you some indication as to where each party is going to go for their legislative agenda. I think it's been very interesting to see not only the president, but Dick Gephardt come out this week and talk about tax cuts. We've all got various varying plans for them. But I think it's something that you're going to see very early in the 104th Congress. Don't think that you're going to see marginal tax rate reduction, though. We still have a tremendous financial obligation to you to balance this budget. And we honestly believe that by the year 2002 that can be accomplished. But it won't be accomplished if we don't address cutting spending in Washington. It can no longer be addressed with tax increases. And one of the changes that you'll see on January the 4th is that we will now require a 3/5 majority of Congress for any new taxes. This has been referred to in the past as a supermajority. George, we may be seeing something like that in Raleigh before we get through with this General Assembly session, I'm hopeful. But I think that it forces Congress to look at the spending side, to look at areas that we can go and actually consolidate, eliminate, and work on really streamlining the functions. I think that very possibly you're looking at the Department of Energy, Housing and Urban Development as possible slots that are consolidated into other areas of government where we can reap the benefits of consolidation, of services within those departments. And I think right now that you can very seriously look at the Department of Education and believe that there are going to be some major changes, if not totally doing away with the Department of Education. Now, what happens when we do that? Block grants begin to be commonplace as it relates to the legislative agenda in Washington. No longer do we have a crime bill that has specifics as to where the money has to be spent. The money will go to Raleigh and to other state capitals, and they will decide whether they pass it on in the form of a block grant to communities. And if they do, your community is responsible to address crime, and you have X amount of money. It's up to the community to decide, in fact, how that money is going to be spent. We're going to try to minimize the guidelines that come with it, but more importantly, we're going to make sure that the reporting process is not one of page after page after page of trying to prove that the money was spent. The question is, are you better suited than the federal government to decide how you're going to solve a crime problem in Wilkes County, or a job creation problem in Wilkes County, or education in Wilkes County? That's what the majority of us in Congress believe today. And the only way that we can successfully have that working is to make sure that the money gets to you and that you have as few strings tied to that money as possible. Very early in January, President Clinton has already agreed that if we will pass legislation to abolish unfunded mandates, that he would sign it. I think then the responsibility is on our General Assembly to try to make some type of similar pact with the communities, but we're hopeful that your local elected officials won't be faced anymore with these tremendous mandates that are created in Washington that we have a very difficult time explaining from a county commissioner level in North Carolina or any other county across the country. But I think it's only right. We've asked the President to put a moratorium on any new regulations to business for the first 100 days of the 104th Congress. Allow us an opportunity to look at them, to do a cost assessment of them, to decide whether or not they make good, common, practical sense for Americans today. The other thing that we're looking at very strongly right now is trying to give a one-year extension to the Clean Air Act, which, George, I'm not sure how we're faced in North Carolina, whether we're under the gun on that, but in many states, they weren't in a position, or if they had to get in a position to adhere to that law, it was going to be a very costly thing. And we're looking for a one-year extension so that we can study whether, in fact, the legislation is target to begin with. These are all things that before the 104th Congress is even convened, we've begun to address. So if there's one thing I'd certainly like to leave you with today, this is a group committed to making sure that one contract with America is fulfilled, which was 10 different areas of legislation that you'll see in the first 100 days. But in addition to that, to make sure that the regulatory burdens that are placed on Americans are reviewed as quickly as we can go through the process, to make sure that if there's a cost factor involved and the benefit is not great enough, that we find a way to begin to change the process. Because I think that's in fact what we're talking about. Washington has to go through a new way of doing things. Anytime you deal with a body where you have people who have been in power for as long as some members of Congress, change comes very slowly, just like it would in any business. I have been ecstatic at the way the Republican leadership has responded not only to their commitment on the contract, but to the suggestion of additional changes that we're looking at daily in Washington. And that's one of the reasons that they've called us up this morning, is to try to fine-tune those over the next 48 to 72 hours to make sure that we have the right legislative agenda starting January the 4th and going into the first 3 months. The unfortunate thing is I don't think you're going to see me very much the first 100 days, nor will my wife, nor will my children. But I think that we have the first real opportunity at significant change, at reform, at really transforming Washington. And I would ask you today that there's one important ingredient, and that's you. If you're not willing to stay engaged with it, it's not going to work. Because the money's going to come, and nobody's going to be here to make the right decision because we don't have enough input from the community. And when that breaks down, we will revert right back to where we were. I also strongly believe that to realign the political process, that Republicans have to maintain majority for at least 3 elections. Now, I don't want that to sound partisan in any way, shape, or form, but it's important that this process go on for about 6 years for it to be permanent. And I think many times we've gotten there, we've talked about it, and 2 years later it changes and we head back in the same direction. This is the first, I believe, real